Hey there, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something that I think has fascinated people for centuries.
Immortality.
Immortality, exactly. But we're not just exploring the, kind of mythical idea of it.
Right.
We're looking at, what happens when science fiction starts to feel a little too real. We've got this fascinating set of sources for this deep dive, and it frames this whole discussion as a Socratic dialogue.
Interesting.
Yeah. Scientists, a poet, and even a philosopher, all weighing in on what a world without death would actually look like.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, for most of human history, immortality was purely the stuff of legends and wishful thinking.
Right.
But with the advancements we're seeing in fields like, biotechnology, AI, even space exploration, it's starting to shift from the realm of fantasy to, a legitimate topic of debate.
I know, it's kind of mind-blowing. And that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because even if we crack the code to living forever, the bigger question is, could we handle it? Not just as individuals, but as a society.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If we didn't have to worry about overpopulation, would we just end up trashing the planet? Or would we become super efficient with resources knowing they have to last well forever?
That's a crucial question, and our sources tackle it head on.
Yeah.
They present this scenario where nobody dies of natural causes.
Okay.
And the population just keeps growing.
Wow.
It really makes you think about how our planet's resources, land, food, water, energy, would hold up under that kind of pressure, especially compared to our current reality, where population growth is actually slowing down in many parts of the world.
The sources paint a pretty vivid picture of this immortal world. And it's striking how the different voices weigh in.
Yes.
The scientist, for instance, is cautiously optimistic.
Yes. They argue that human ingenuity has always found a way, pointing to potential solutions like space colonization.
Oh, wow.
Incredibly efficient agriculture, even the promise of fusion power.
Okay.
But the poet in our dialogue takes a different view.
They seem much more wary of the idea, right?
Right.
Worried about overcrowding, leading to conflict, and the potential for ecological disaster.
Right.
It's like those classic sci-fi stories where everyone's crammed into these mega cities while the rest of the planet is a barren wasteland.
That's a great comparison.
Yeah.
But then our philosopher throws in a curveball, suggesting that maybe the core issue isn't the resources themselves, but our attitude towards them.
Okay, unpack that for me and for our listeners.
Okay.
What do they mean?
They pose a really thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If we lived forever, would we still be so obsessed with accumulating more and more stuff? Or would we find different things to value?
So instead of collecting, fancy cars or designer clothes, we'd be seeking out knowledge experiences, or maybe even something more intangible like wisdom.
Exactly.
I can see how that shift in values could potentially change the whole equation.
Yes.
What do our sources say about how likely that kind of shift is?
Well, they don't offer a definitive answer.
Okay.
But they highlight how a change in our fundamental reality, like removing the limit on our lifespan, could lead to some pretty drastic shifts in our motivations.
It's fascinating to think about how that might play out. But even if we did somehow solve the resource problem, whether through technological innovation or a total philosophical overhaul, wouldn't that just bring up a whole new set of challenges?
Absolutely. And our sources dig into that as well, specifically when it comes to the technologies themselves.
Right. Because it's easy to get swept up in the excitement of things like lab-grown meat, fusion power, 3D printed housing.
Yes.
But how realistic is all this stuff? I mean, are we on the verge of a technological utopia, or is this just wishful thinking?
It's a bit of both, actually. Some of these technologies, like lab-grown meat, are already being produced commercially.
Right.
And fusion power research is making some promising strides. But scaling these technologies up to meet the needs of a potentially immortal population is a whole other ballgame.
That makes sense. And even if we could produce enough food, energy, and housing for everyone, wouldn't that just create new problems?
Yes.
Like, who controls access to these life-extending technologies? The poet in our dialogue brings up some interesting points about this.
Yes. They're concerned that even with unlimited resources, we'd still be faced with the same issues of economic and political inequality that we see today.
So even in a world of abundance, there's still the potential for power struggles and conflict, just over different things.
Right.
it really makes you question whether human nature would fundamentally change even if our circumstances did.
That's a great point, and it's something our sources grapple with as they explore the complexities of a world where death is no longer the great equalizer.
One idea they put forward is a pretty radical one.
Okay.
A global governing body to oversee these immortality technologies and ensure equitable access for everyone.
Okay.
It's a compelling idea.
Yeah.
But is it even remotely realistic?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Our sources highlight both the potential benefits and the immense difficulties of such a system. On one hand, having a unified approach could help prevent the misuse of these powerful technologies.
Right.
On the other hand, getting all the countries in the world to agree on something this massive, on something that touches every aspect of life and death, feels almost impossible.
Especially when you consider that we can't even agree on things like climate change.
Right.
Which, is kind of important for our continued existence as a species.
Exactly.
And let's not forget about the whole issue of powerful tech companies potentially trying to control the immortality game. We're already seeing the challenges of regulating big tech.
Yeah.
And this would take things to a whole new level.
You're right. That's a huge concern.
Yeah.
If a handful of corporations were to gain control of these technologies, they could essentially dictate the terms of who gets to live forever and under what conditions.
It's a pretty dystopian thought.
It really is.
Okay, but let's say for the sake of argument that we somehow manage to establish some kind of global rules for immortality.
Right.
The next question is who gets to make those rules?
Right.
And this is where our sources present a really fascinating dilemma. They point out that there's a real tension between expertise and representation.
Yes.
On one hand, you have tech companies with all the scientific know-how to develop and implement these technologies.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's ordinary people whose lives will be most impacted by them.
That's right.
So how do you balance the need for technical competence with the importance of democratic decision-making in something as monumental as this?
Yeah.
It's like a choose-your-own-adventure story with no good options.
That's exactly the challenge our sources are grappling with.
Yeah.
And it raises some pretty profound questions about the nature of governance in a world transformed by radical life extension.
It's a lot to unpack. But one thing's clear. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we're even going to consider a future with immortality, we need to start thinking now about how to create a system that's both just and equitable.
I agree. It's not a conversation we can afford to put off.
Okay. Before we get too overwhelmed, I think it's time to take a little break.
Okay.
We'll be back in a flash to explore even more mind-blowing questions about the implications of living forever.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Right.
Welcome back. I don't know about you, but I'm still reeling from that last discussion. It's incredible how quickly things get complicated when you start talking about a world without death.
It certainly makes you question a lot of assumptions, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay.
But before we dive back into the ethics and the societal structures,
right,
I think there's a more fundamental question we need to grapple with.
Okay.
If you could live forever, would we even want to?
That's the heart of what our sources call immortality's paradox.
Okay.
It's this idea that the very thing we seem to crave, eternal life, might end up robbing life of its meaning.
It's a fascinating paradox. Is it like when you have too many options and you end up feeling paralyzed by indecision?
Right.
Or when you have so much of something that it loses its value? Does life become less precious if it's infinite?
That's the concern that some of our sources raise. They suggest that without the pressure of a ticking clock, without the knowledge that our time is limited, we might become complacent, lose our drive, maybe even slip into a kind of nihilism, the belief that nothing really matters because it's all just going to go on forever anyway.
I can see how that could happen.
Yeah.
It's like, why bother putting in the effort if you have an eternity to achieve your goals, right?
Exactly.
But our sources don't just dwell on the negative, do they?
No, they offer a counterpoint.
Yep.
They explore the idea that instead of leading to apathy, immortality could fuel this incredible desire to experience everything.
Oh, wow.
Imagine having eons to master every skill, to travel to every corner of the universe, to delve into every field of knowledge that has ever existed or ever will exist.
That does sound pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Like the ultimate bucket list with no time limit.
Right.
But if everyone had that same opportunity,
yeah,
wouldn't it create a sort of homogenized experience? Would there even be a concept of individual achievement if everyone had the time to become an expert in, well, everything?
That's a great question, and it's something the sources touch on.
Okay.
They suggest that with infinite time, the focus might shift away from material achievements and external validation towards more internal pursuits.
So instead of striving for wealth or status,
yes,
people might be more driven by things like creativity, self-discovery, maybe even spiritual growth.
Exactly.
And who knows what kinds of art, music, literature, or scientific breakthroughs might emerge from a society that's no longer constrained by the limitations of a finite lifespan.
That's right. It's a fascinating thought.
It is. So to bring this back to our listeners, what I'm hearing is that the sources are saying immortality doesn't automatically guarantee happiness or meaning.
Right.
It just gives us a much, much larger playground to figure those things out on our own terms.
That's a good way to put it. Immortality doesn't solve the big existential questions. It just amplifies them.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront maybe more directly than ever before what it means to be human, what we truly value, and what we want to do with this potentially infinite gift of time.
That's a really powerful thought. And brings up another big question for me.
Okay.
And probably for a lot of our listeners. Relationships. Because right now, so much of how we form and experience relationships is shaped by the fact that we're all gonna die someday.
Right.
What happens to love, to family, to friendship in a world where death is no longer a factor?
That's something our sources explore.
Okay.
And it gets pretty complex.
Yeah.
On one hand, you can imagine the depth of connection you could build with someone over centuries, even millennia.
Wow.
Shared experiences growing and evolving together.
Yeah.
It's almost unimaginable.
I can see how that could lead to an incredible level of intimacy and understanding.
Yeah.
But what about the flip side? What happens when things go wrong?
Yeah.
What if you end up in a relationship that's no longer working?
Yeah.
But you're stuck with that person for like 1,000 years.
That's certainly a possibility. The sources acknowledge that the potential for both profound connection and epic conflict would likely be magnified in an immortal society. And it's not just romantic relationships, it's family structures as well.
Okay.
Would traditional ideas of marriage and parenthood even make sense in a world without death?
It's interesting to think about how those structures might adapt or even be completely redefined. Maybe instead of nuclear families, you'd have these multi-generational communities spanning centuries.
Yeah.
Or perhaps people would form different kinds of bonds altogether based more on shared interests or goals rather than traditional family ties.
The sources leave a lot of room for speculation on that front.
Yeah.
But they do make it clear that our social structures, our understanding of family, of a commitment, of what it means to belong, all of that, would have to evolve in some pretty radical ways to accommodate the realities of an immortal existence.
It's like every time we solve one potential problem with immortality, we just uncover a whole new set of challenges.
That's a great observation. And it underscores the fact that immortality isn't just a technological puzzle to solve.
Right.
It's a philosophical, social, even spiritual revolution. It forces us to re-examine everything we think we know about being human.
Okay, so after all this deep thinking, I have to ask.
Yeah.
Is it possible that all this talk about immortality is just a way to avoid facing our own mortality?
Right.
Wouldn't it be healthier to just accept that we're all going to die someday and focus on living our best lives in the time we have?
That's a perspective that many people share.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a valid one. But our sources offer a different way of looking at it.
Okay.
They suggest that maybe the very act of contemplating immortality, even if it remains out of reach, can be a valuable exercise in itself.
Awesome.
Because it forces us to confront our deepest fears and desires, to ask ourselves what we truly want to accomplish with our lives, what legacy we want to leave behind, how we want to be remembered.
So even if we never actually achieve immortality, just thinking about it can help us live more meaningful lives right now.
That's the idea. It's like holding up a mirror to our own existence and asking, what are we doing with this precious finite time that we have?
I like that.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of meaning and purpose is something we can and should be engaging with right now, regardless of whether or not we ever unlock the secret to eternal life.
I agree. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this whole discussion.
I can't wait to hear what it is. But first, we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to delve into the final chapter of our exploration of immortality.
All right.
We're back and ready to kind of wrap up our deep dive into immortality. You know, after all these mind-bending conversations, I'm struck by how much ground we've covered. We've talked about resources, ethics, even the very essence of what it means to live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
But there's one area we haven't really explored as deeply.
Okay.
And it's a pretty crucial one.
I think I know where you're going with this. We've talked about the societal implications, the philosophical dilemmas.
Yeah.
But what about the individual?
Exactly. It's almost like we've been so focused on the big picture questions.
Right.
That we've forgotten about the most fundamental unit of this whole equation, the human brain.
Yes.
I mean, our brains are essentially wired for a finite lifespan.
Right, right. We have these built-in mechanisms for dealing with aging, with loss, with the knowledge that our time is limited.
Yeah.
So what happens when you remove those limitations?
It's a question that our sources only touch on briefly, but it raises some fascinating possibilities. Would we still experience the same range of emotions? Would joy and sorrow feel as intense if we knew we had an eternity to process them?
It's a fascinating thought experiment.
Yeah.
Imagine experiencing the highs and lows of life, but with the perspective of centuries or even millennia behind you.
Right.
Would it dull the intensity of those emotions, or would it amplify them in ways we can't even comprehend?
And what about memory? Would we be able to retain all of our experiences over such a vast lifespan? Or would our brains develop some kind of filtering system to avoid complete overload?
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine trying to recall a specific event from, say, 500 years ago? It's mind-boggling.
Our sources don't delve into the specific neurological mechanisms, but they do highlight the potential for both enhanced and altered cognitive function. Maybe we develop new ways of storing and accessing memories, or perhaps our brains would naturally prioritize and categorize experiences in ways that are completely foreign to us now.
It makes you wonder if the very nature of personal growth would change. Would we still feel the same drive to evolve and learn if we knew we had forever to do it?
That's a key question. Would we become incredibly specialized, dedicating centuries to mastering a particular field or skill?
Right.
Or would we hop between passions, immersing ourselves in one pursuit for a few hundred years before moving on to something completely different?
It's almost too much to wrap your head around.
It is.
All the possibilities that open up when you remove the constraint of time.
Yeah.
It's exhilarating and a little terrifying at the same time.
I agree. And it brings us back to that core paradox we've been discussing.
Yeah.
The very thing we crave, unlimited time, might end up altering our experience of life in ways we can't predict, maybe even undermining the very things that make life worth living in the first place.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you realize that immortality isn't just about extending life.
Right.
It's about fundamentally changing the human experience.
Yes.
And maybe, just maybe, that's something we need to approach with a lot more caution and humility than we often see in the headlines.
Absolutely. I think that's a crucial point for our listeners to consider. This isn't just a fun thought experiment.
Right.
It's a conversation with real-world implications. As science continues to push the boundaries of what's possible, we need to engage with these questions on a deeper level.
Well said. So after diving deep into all these sources, what's your biggest takeaway? What's the one thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
You know, it's interesting. We started this exploration by asking whether immortality is possible. But what's become clear to me is that the real question isn't about achieving immortality, but about whether we as a species are ready for it.
Expand on that a little. What do you mean by ready?
Think about it. If we can't even solve the problems we're facing today, poverty, war, inequality, climate change,
right,
how can we possibly expect to handle the even greater complexities of an immortal future? It's like we're trying to run before we can walk.
So you're saying we need to get our own house in order before we even start thinking about living forever?
Exactly. Immortality isn't just about extending lifespan. It's about extending our capacity for wisdom, compassion, and responsibility. It's about evolving as a species, not just biologically, but ethically and morally.
That's a powerful thought. And I think it's a perfect place to end our deep dive. We've explored the science, the ethics, the philosophy, even the psychology of living forever. But ultimately, the question of immortality isn't just about the future.
Right.
It's about how we choose to live right now.
Well said. Perhaps the pursuit of immortality, even if it ultimately proves impossible, can serve as a catalyst for personal and societal transformation. It can inspire us to strive for a better world, not just for ourselves, but for all generations to come.
What a profound thought to leave our listeners with. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to spark your curiosity and challenge your assumptions. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.